Sometimes murder is more than just murder. Sometimes the act of homicide has ramifications beyond the life and death of an individual. Sometimes killing a person can be a political act. In the case of the Papin Sisters, murder was an act of class warfare. But how did the murderous rage of two poor young girls shake the foundation of the French society? The Papin sisters' parents, Gustave and Clemence, met in the early 1900s in Le Mans, France. They perhaps not even destined to be married until their first pregnancy arrived. This was their first child, Emilia, whose life was marred in controversy. Though Clemence and Gustave had married, the couple did not trust one another. Gustave was convinced that Clemence was having an affair and he drank heavily. When Gustave announced that the family would be moving to another city, Clemence said she'd rather commit suicide than go with him. The whole household was fractured and enraged. When Emilia was around 10, she was sent to a convent school. There, it was discovered that Gustave had raped his daughter. Emilia never returned home. But two more children were born to the broken marriage. There was Christine, born in 1905, and Leah, born in 1911. As soon as she was born, Christine was given away to a loving aunt. She lived with her aunt for 7 years before she was able to join a Catholic orphanage and train to become a nun, like her older sister. But Clemence put a stop to this. She took her daughter back in and put her up for employment. Christine was going to earn money for the family. Leah suffered a similar existence, given away to a family member until she was old enough to earn money. Christine had a reputation as a hard worker and a good cook. Leah was more introverted and quieter, rarely displaying anything other than complete obedience to her employers. Christine was considered the clever one, though the older they grew, the more inseparable they became. The two began to work as maids in the same households. Whenever they could, they worked together. It was this arrangement that brought them in 1926 to a house in Le Mans. It was the home of René Lancelin, a retired solicitor who lived with his family. Lancelin had 2 adult daughters, one who had married and moved out, and one who remained at home. The Papin sisters were happy to find work together in the Lancelin household. People didn't notice them much. They were quiet and kept to themselves. Like most girls, they attended church on Sundays, but seemed to have few hobbies or interests. Even if they were not seen talking together often, people noted an eerie bond which existed between the Papin sisters. The work was long and hard, and the sisters often worked 14-hour days for little pay. They shared a little room at the top of the house, but this was common for many housemaids who were treated horrifically. Unfortunately for Christine and Leah, they had traded one unhappy home for another. Leonie Lancelin, René's wife, suffered from severe depression. In a rage, she picked the 2 girls as targets. Leonie beat the 2 girls mercilessly. Whenever she noticed a mistake or an error made by the Papin sisters, she lashed out. Leonie slammed the sisters' heads against the walls of the house. The 2 working-class girls could do very little to fight back against their employers, but when the beatings became too extreme, they decided to fight back. On the evening of February the 2nd, 1933, René Lancelin was scheduled to meet his wife and daughter for dinner at the home of a friend. Leonie and her daughter had spent the day shopping together. They returned home ahead of their dinner party to change and ready themselves. When they walked to the door, they discovered the house cloaked in darkness. The power was out. The Papin sisters explained to their employers, caused by Christine using a faulty electrical device. This drove Leonie into a furious rage. She began to beat both sisters, shouting and screaming at them. This was the last straw. As Leonie beat Leah, Christine set sights on the Lancelin daughter. She lunged for the girl, thrusting her fingers into the girl's eyes and gouging them from the sockets. Spotting her sister's violence, Leah began to fight back. She attacked Leonie, aiming for the woman's eyes, just as Christine had done. As Leah and Leonie fought, Christine ran downstairs. She grabbed a knife and a hammer from the servants' quarter. Christine climbed the stairs, weapons in hand. She found Leah and Leonie still fighting. She stabbed and slashed at the women. As all three fought, one of the Papin sisters laid their hands on a heavy pewter pitcher. She brought it crashing down onto the heads of both the Lancelin women. Eventually, Leonie and her daughter lay dead in a pool of blood. The fight may have lasted as long as 30 minutes. A short time later, René arrived home. He noticed the lights were out, and when he approached, the door was locked too. At first, he figured that his family had simply left early for the dinner party. So he went to the home of his friend, expecting to see Leonie and his daughter already there. They were not. Collecting his son-in-law, René returned to his home, his suspicion growing by the minute. By the time they reached the house, it was nearly 7 o'clock in the evening. The house was still dark, the doors were still locked, bolted shut from the inside. As the two men looked up, they saw a single light glowing in the upstairs window, the Papin Sisters' room. René and his son-in-law began to worry. They went to the nearest police station and asked an officer for help. Arriving back at the house, the policeman leapt over a garden wall and broke into the rear of the house. Inside, he found an orgy of blood. The bodies of the two Lancelin women were battered beyond belief. They were almost unrecognisable. Leonie's eyes had been gouged out, the sockets and tucked into the scarf around her neck. One of her daughter's eyes was found before her body. The other had rolled away. The policeman advanced cautiously, assuming that the two poor maids would have suffered the same fate. But when he reached their room, he found it locked. He knocked. No one answered. Worried, he summoned a locksmith. Eventually they burst into the room. The Papin sisters were in bed together, naked. A bloody hammer, still coated in a tangle of flesh and hair, lay on a chair nearby. Almost immediately, the girls confessed. Immediately, the sisters were thrown into jail. They were put in separate cells. After Leah began to act out, the prison officers relented and allowed them to jail together. When the two sisters saw one another, Christine allegedly threw herself at Leah and unbuttoned her blouse. To the French media, this was taken as the sign of a sensuous relationship. Later in the year, Christine had a fit. She tried to gouge out her own eyes, and the prison forced her into a straitjacket. When she spoke to the court, she said she had suffered a similar attack on the day of the murder. Nevertheless, the sisters were deemed sane. In the end, the jury took just 40 minutes to find them guilty of murder. Leah, it was decided, was acting under the influence of her sister. She received a sentence of 10 years. Christine was not so lucky. She was determined to be the instigator of the attack and was sentenced to death by guillotine. Later, however, this was commuted to a life sentence. Prison proved too much for Christine, especially being apart from her sister. She suffered from depression and eventually stopped eating. She was transferred to a mental health facility. Leah fared better and served 8 of her 10 years before being released. She then lived under an assumed name for the rest of her life and is now presumed dead. But aside from the sisters themselves, the case sensationalized the French media. The case was debated furiously by every side. Many held it aloft as a sign of the oppressed state of the workers in France. They suggested that the murder of the two women by the Papin sisters was an act of class warfare. It was, they said, indicative of the struggles of the working class in France. The case has lingered in the French consciousness, inspiring books, documentaries and plays. But the tale of the two French sisters driven to murder remains, like the sisters themselves, very private. Was it a sudden burst of violence, a premeditated attack, a mental health issue, an incestuous bond, or an act of class warfare? We may never know the truth,